Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Howard Husock, the author of The Projects, A New History of Public Housing. This is his fourth book, and he is a senior fellow at American Enterprise and has also worked for the Manhattan Institute. Howard, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The projects are a place, at least in popular memory, one all-encompassing place. No matter which ones you're describing or what their actual name is, they all do have names. They say, I live in the projects, or I think he lives in the projects. It happened in the projects. They were supposed to be government-funded places of affordable housing for anyone who needed help. They were intended to lift people up. In New York, they were often big towers. In other cities, though, they are smaller. And that surprised me when I finally moved out of New York. The projects are not always big, tall buildings. In many, but not all cases, they became incubators of crime, drugs, and even poverty itself. And so when I was in high school, someone got mugged in the projects next to us on 61st Street on the west side there. Where did it happen? It happened in the projects. So first of all, how did public housing come to be called just the projects?
Well, I think it's because, Evan, they were a project themselves. They were a project of some benevolent intellectuals, which I think will surprise people. They started really with an idea outside of government. What I focus on in the book as the kind of mysterious underpinning of this project that was a shared goal of a number of people was the Museum of Modern Art in New York had a show in 1934, and they brought together some of the leading luminaries in New York, intellectuals, politicians, not people who lived in poor neighborhoods, notably. And they had a shared project. Their shared project had two parts. One was to demolish slums, slum clearance, tear down neighborhoods that they thought were dangerous, immoral, disease-ridden, and were just not good places to live. And then secondarily, to replace them with this project of theirs, which was a new kind of city. It wasn't just that it was government-owned housing or housing for the poor. It was going to be what Le Corbusier, who was the French architect and their ideal really, called the radiant city, a city without streets, buildings set in green campuses, apart from the hustle and bustle of cities, with amenities. They were going to build these new neighborhoods for the poor, and it was their shared project as to how the poor people in residence of what they managed to convince, starting with the Roosevelt administration, the government to build, how they started to call it the projects. I guess they must have inferred that it was a project.
AxelbankHistory.com, by the way, was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. Check out Nikki's work. All right. Some of the stats that you have at the beginning of your book are unbelievable, shocking. The median public household income is $9,000, which means half the people in public housing are making less than that somehow. Only 15% report earning wages. 20% of violent crime in New York comes from public housing, even though the projects are only 4% of all housing. 3% are two-parent households. 3% two-parent households. This is, I hesitate a little bit to ask this question, but I've got to ask: how is public housing with those results? How is it even still legal?
Well, I think one of the most important things to understand is this is not what was intended. It was not intended to be housing for the poor and the poorest. It was going to be working class housing. And in the beginning, it was. In the book, I talk about a short lived golden age of public housing, where public housing was picky about who they were going to let in. They insisted on two-parent families. They insisted on wage earners. And when in the immediate era after World War II, households didn't have much choice because housing production had been stalled during the war. People were happy to get into public housing. But then gradually and then really quickly, it devolved into the last resort for people who had no other option. And that's how it became a concentration of poverty. And that's what you describe, and that's what those statistics reflect.
Did
The idea that it became the slum that it was supposed to replace is both ironic and tragic.
did they begin eroding the standards of who was being let in? You make one exception here, one exception there.
Well, there was a key turning point, uh, and that was in St. Louis. There was a super high rise project called Pruitt-Igoe. Some of your listeners may be familiar with it from famous photos of it being blown up or imploded. But as it deteriorated, and St. Louis residents who had options to move to the suburbs, and it became a concentration, a federal ghetto is how it was described by an important Harvard sociologist named Lee Rainwater. The residents could no longer afford the rent. People may not realize it, that the rents were supposed to cover the maintenance of public housing. Government was going to subsidize the construction through bond borrowings, but then the rents of the working class people were going to pay the bills, maintain the elevators, keep the halls clean, cut the grass, all of that. But then once it became a concentration of poverty, the residents said, we can't afford these rents. And then the United States Senate stepped in to quote unquote help them. So you're right, these rents are too expensive. We're going to limit your rent to 30%, 25% of your income. Today it's 30%. And with that, it was as if the Senate applied a tourniquet to the revenue, the bloodstream of public housing authorities all around the country. Suddenly, the money they were expecting to get from tenants was going to be limited. And at that point, things really started to go downhill fast. And 4 years after that, that was 1969, 4 years after that, those same projects in St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe, which had been named the high-rise architect building of the year in 1952 by Architectural Forum magazine. By 1973, basically 20 years later, it was blown up because it was so dangerous and irredeemable.
How, zooming out from just the concept of the projects, I'm just curious in terms of from a societal perspective, how important is it to understand, or in understanding the projects, to understand the opposite of the projects, the people who can afford to fully live in safe housing and move at will to a safer place if they need to, and be sort of in a self-sufficient cycle? How important is it to understand what the opposite of the projects are?
Well, it's important to understand that that's the majority of Americans by far. And one of the reasons the projects went downhill is because starting 1946, 1947, the suburbs happened, right? So the progenitors, the advocates of public housing, they thought most people were going to be in the situation that describes those in the projects, the very poor, and capitalism was going to fail them. And for the most part, of course, there's inequality, of course, there's exceptions, but for the most part, they were wrong. And starting with the construction of new communities like Levittown in New York, 17,000 small new houses. Instead of moving to the projects, people moved en masse from Brooklyn, from the south side of Chicago, all over to these small new houses in the suburbs where they could accumulate wealth, where they can have small yards. And they weren't grand mansions. The Levittown houses were 750 square feet, tiny. If we allowed those kind of houses to be built today, then even some of the poorest people could live in those safe kind of situations that you describe. But certainly there are people who are in the opposite of those safe situations. And there are ways that we should address that.
It was fascinating to see that the roots of public housing in Europe are in Karl Marx. Explain what his perspective was on public housing?
Well, I don't think Marx himself specifically addressed housing. He certainly believed in state ownership of the means of production. But the Karl Marx houses in Vienna, which still stand, it's huge. It's on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Their idea was that government would run most of the housing, most of the housing. And so that meant that middle class people would be living in government run and managed housing. And when middle class people didn't have an option, that's true in Singapore, for instance, today, which is majority publicly financed housing. When people don't have an option, well, that puts pressure on the government to maintain the housing and for a wide range of social classes to live in that housing. That happened in pockets in Europe. Vienna is the best known example, but the rents cover the bills there because you have upper middle class people living in public housing. That's just not true here, obviously.
What city here in the United States was first to try, and how did it go at first?
Well, New York was the leader, and New York started public housing before the New Deal, before the National Housing Act of 1937, which laid the groundwork for a federal involvement. The first houses in New York was a renovated tenement, as the word is used in New York. Eleanor Roosevelt herself cut the ribbon. She was a huge advocate of public housing. By the way, she was an advocate of white housing and black housing. And the Roosevelts cut the ribbon on segregated housing, both of them. And that's another story. But so New York and LaGuardia led the way, and they were the example that inspired the National Housing Act of 1937, which was sponsored by Robert Wagner, the senator from New York. He, by the way, allied, and people won't realize this, with Stegall of Stegall Glass, Senator Stegall of Alabama. And the Southerners bought into public housing because they realized they could use it to tear down black neighborhoods and mixed neighborhoods, racially mixed neighborhoods, and use government funding as a tool of segregation, which they did on a grand scale. And there are public housing authorities throughout the Deep South, which were used for that purpose, and then most of which became all black as they are today.
And was the intention to have not just housing? I mean, you mentioned this a little bit here, but the intention was to have housing and stores and green spaces and parks and sort of these fully functional neighborhoods that people effectively wouldn't have to leave until they hopefully would go to work.
Well, actually, that's true for the most part. They were self-contained communities, but they didn't include stores. And this is a big problem.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge mistake because you can get income from these stores.
And you can own businesses. So one of the main and I think original themes of my book is that a great deal was lost in slum clearance. And one of the most important things that was lost was small business ownership. So for instance, in Southwest Washington, which was the largest single slum clearance project in the United States, an entirely African-American neighborhood, 1,000 Black-owned businesses were taken and demolished. And that was before home rule in Washington. So they did it without any say-so. And so once you were moved, relocated into public housing, not only did you not have a convenient place to get your prescription filled or buy a newspaper when that was a thing, still is for a few people, you didn't have the chance to own your own business. Businesses were demolished, they were taken, and these artificial communities, without not only without businesses, but without churches, without civic associations, the progressives, and they saw themselves as progressives, not in terms of the pejorative that we use it today. They were full-on progressives when that was a good term for everybody. They viewed these communities as benevolent communities for those moving into them.
What was the mechanism by which people would begin to succeed and then not need public housing? What was the theory on how people would sort of graduate from it?
Well, it's really interesting. There's an assumption today that that was the theory, that you would use that as a starting point for upward mobility. But that was not the theory of the originators of public housing. They thought it was going to be like a public utility. And you just stayed there forever. You stayed in public housing of one sort or another, and it would be well maintained. Your rents would cover the bill. It was like being in a normal apartment, if you will. And so the idea that it was a launching pad for upward mobility has been retrospectively projected onto public housing because that actually did happen for a lot of people. It was not the original intention, but we see Sonia Sotomayor started in public housing. Lloyd Blankfein, he became the head of Goldman Sachs. He started in public housing, you know. So Elvis Presley lived in public housing in Memphis. Obviously moved up.
How did your previous book, The Poor Side of Town and Why We Need It, lead you to this topic?
Well, my view in The Poor Side of Town relates to the public housing books in the following way, is that I think it's fair to say that they both can be termed defenses of so-called slums. I'm a slum defender. And that's because I think the slums that were demolished were much misunderstood, and that we need to appreciate the need to have what those so-called slums offer. And this was the theme of The Poor Side of Town: small houses on small lots that are naturally affordable because they're modest homes that are inexpensive to build and are inexpensive to live in because of their sheer density. Density got a bad name. Slums had to be cleared. I regard that as an original sin of housing policy, our failure to appreciate the importance of dense housing on small lots. And so I hoped through The Poor Side of Town that communities would understand that maybe not every house has to be a 5,000 square foot mansion on 2 acres, but you could have a group of row houses near the train tracks that were 750 square feet, like those Levittown houses. And that way, kids who grew up in town could stay. Teachers and firefighters could live in the towns that they're serving. That's my theory of the poor side of town. And what was lost in the slums, that's chapter 3 in the public housing book, what was lost was just incalculable. The small businesses, the mutual aid associations. I'm associated with a think tank that's known as conservative. I think I'm kind of iconoclastic. But one of the things that conservatives tend to ascribe to African Americans is a failure to be entrepreneurial, to have their own businesses. Well, they were taken from them by eminent domain en masse. 1,000 small businesses in Washington, 1,000. And we wonder why Black people are not entrepreneurial, because we discourage them.
Did you approach this with an opinion, or did your opinion form as you did the research?
I approached this with curiosity. To me, it was an interesting historical policy mystery. How did public housing happen in the United States of America, which is so dedicated to private property and home ownership? They're almost mantras of, that should be in the Constitution almost. And so I said, how did this happen? And unraveling that mystery led me to the Museum of Modern Art show, to the Slum Clearance Committee headed by Robert Moses in New York, to the fact that at its height, the Slum Clearance Committee under Moses was tearing down 60 buildings a month. A month. You think all those people suddenly had great new houses to live in? I think they were on the street, moving in with their in-laws. So figuring out that mystery as a historical inquisitor was really my main motivation. And so that was what helped me uncover the Museum of Modern Art show, the leadership of policy intellectuals and elites, really. They never consulted poor people. Never. That to me is one of the lessons of this, is we have to be very careful about letting elites decide what is good for the poor. The poor were never consulted. You think your neighborhood should be torn down? You think your business should be taken? You think you should be relocated on the outskirts of town in high rises where there are no stores and no cross streets. Nobody asked them.
What were your sources for this? Was it a newspaper dig? Were there public records? How did you put this all together?
Well, there's vast public records. Census records are a fantastic resource, starting in the 1950 census, and especially starting with the 1940 census of housing. So you can peer into what poor neighborhoods were like, what their occupations were, how many stores were located there, what was it like to live on Cherry Street on the Lower East Side before it got demolished for a public housing project that was actually not built. That was one source. The source, the records, especially of the New York City Housing Authority, which has always been the leader, and it today is 177,000 of the 800,000 remaining public housing units are in New York. It's really the big kahuna in New York in public housing history. And they have fantastic records at LaGuardia Community College, where I spent a lot of time immersed in would have been used to be microfilm, but now it's digital, thank goodness.
And what's in the records? Are they like meeting minutes? And
Yes.
yeah.
Letters, Robert Moses's correspondence, the correspondence of Langdon Post, the first commissioner of public housing in New York, essays written for magazines that were then archived in the Housing Authority, and especially photographs of what was torn down, which were very moving and very poignant.
How important were the interviews that you did for this book? One thing that's really interesting is that you have really great first person type things, which is not super common in academic books. Academic authors often go through the sort of record of the historiography and they pull things from there, but you talk to real people. How important was that?
Well, to me, I'm a journalist type. Like you, my first job, I don't know if it was your first job, but like your job now, 1973, I was a general assignment reporter for the Middletown New York Times Herald Record, covering the 5-county region. So I've always been a reporter type. Then I became more of an academic. I was at the School of Government at Harvard, and then at these different think tanks that you mentioned, including American Enterprise today. But I never lost that sense that you should touch the face of reality as a reporter, as a test for what you're thinking. And so I wanted to see what public housing was like today. And so I went to the Bronx. I went to New Bern, North Carolina, as a representative of all those 200 small communities in the Deep South where people don't associate with public housing. And what's the experience of people today? And in part because I wanted to be able to offer something, not only a critique, but some kind of constructive way forward that I could test with tenants and developers. How should we make sense and help this system do something constructive today, even though I do regard it as kind of an original sin of public housing, of housing policy. But here we are, what can we do now? And the only way to get a sense of that is to visit.
Did you just kind of walk up to people? Hey, how are you? I'm Howard. I'm working on a book. I want to know if I could have a few minutes of your time. That's what I do. So I'm wondering if that's how you
Well,
did it.
I'll just say you don't go into the South Bronx that way. You got to have a contact, and New York City Housing Authority has resident officers. You can get in touch with them, set up interviews. Local housing authorities have tenant representatives. So I use the sinews of government to get in touch with tenant representatives and developers. So, but once I was there, then you would have random encounters, and that did add as well. You always have
Um,
to be curious about that.
I don't think there's any doubt that, look, it's not a secret. You're not necessarily demographically the person who's living in public housing. How much of a barrier was that for you to approach people and to do a book about people and about situations that are just not where you are at in your station in life?
I didn't feel it was a problem at all. I've always felt that as a journalist, I always felt that if you approach people in a spirit of goodwill and curiosity, They like to be asked about their lives and they want to share about their lives. And that was certainly my sense, going to the Andrew Jackson houses in the South Bronx. Tenants wanted to talk to me. Never occurred to them that I was different or it shouldn't be. They wanted to share their experience. And maybe they thought I was likely to bring it to a wider audience. I couldn't tell you, but there was no, in practice, there was no barrier. And, I'm enough of a residual 60s liberal that I think that white people should be interested in the fate of minorities. And that's always been an impulse of mine, and it's part of the impulse in this book.
I'm really curious about one aspect of your background here. You were on the board of public broadcasting, nominated by Barack Obama. How fearful are you of the future of public broadcasting, given there's an enormous amount of news about it right now, given the funding is changing dramatically?
Well, my role when I was on the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I was a consistent advocate to protect and channel as much money as possible, not to NPR and PBS. I always thought they'd be able to raise money themselves because they have a national listener and viewer base and a lot of foundation support. I was worried about your station in Tampa, St. Pete, the station in Bessemer, Alabama. There are over 1,000 local stations. And they're the ones, if somebody's going to cover the fate of public housing projects in their communities, in these what are come to be called news deserts, well, then they're the ones that we should look to. And I'm continuing to advocate for this kind of funding. I'm going to have an essay in the Chronicle of Philanthropy this coming up Wednesday. It's kind of the Bible of philanthropic donors, urging big foundations, not only from the left, but from the right too, to get together and create an endowment for local public broadcasting stations, many of which partner with what's left of local newspapers so that city councils can be covered every week. So when public housing needs funding or has problems, somebody's going to report on that. So to me, NPR was unfortunately the face of public media, as they call it, for the Republicans in Congress. And NPR tilted too far left in its story selection, particularly. And local stations are the ones that are going to cover the city council. We need to protect those. And if big foundations don't step up, then local community foundations need to step up and individual donors need to step up. And that's tough in places that don't have a lot of money.
Yeah. All right. So back to the projects here. One thing that's really, no, it's fascinating answer, but one thing that's super interesting is that you have stories from people, they're anecdotal, but you have stories from people who love the projects, who, found it to be a rewarding place. Who are the people who tended to be the exceptions? Can they be placed in certain categories?
They can be placed in what I call the golden years of public housing, the 1950s and early 1960s. And some of them exude enthusiasm about the same projects that later became cesspools and were torn down. The Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, which was the emblematic high rise, the focus of Nicholas Lemon's book about the Great Migration from the South to Chicago. In the early 50s, it was celebrated, appreciated. Then by the late 1960s, it was the subject of, well, the Ida B. Lynch houses. It's another one. First, it was celebrated. Then it was the subject of one of the most famous documentaries on public television, getting back to that. Public Housing, it's called very simply, by Frederick Wiseman, our great documentarian. It became notorious. So over time, when they first cut the ribbon, and this is what worries me about affordable housing of all kinds, that it continues to be built and subsidized. When you cut the ribbon, it looks good. Over time, it wasn't maintained. So the same projects were celebrated and then demolished.
There was a name that you mentioned that I want to ask about, Robert Moses, the subject of what I believe is potentially, other than yours, the greatest book on politics in the history of American nonfiction writing. what role did Robert Moses play in public housing? And, Robert Caro, argues that he sort of set up these two New Yorks. How did public housing fit into his scheme of building roads and infrastructure and parks, and all the rest? And where did public housing land on his list of things that New York needed to have?
Well, remember, Moses thought of himself as part of the progressive project. So all of his projects, for good or ill, were part of his progressive vision. So you would have uh, swimming pools and parks for the masses, the largest public beach in the United States, Orchard Beach in the Bronx, amenities for the public, for the working class. That's how Moses saw himself. And public housing was part of that. Palaces for the people. There's actually a book about public housing called Palaces for the People. That's what Moses thought he was doing. In the event, in the articulation, the realization of that vision, he certainly helped to segregate New York racially because he built public housing coincident with neighborhoods that were already predominantly Black. And so he reinforced the segregation that already existed. But fascinatingly, the names of public housing projects in New York and elsewhere, Langston Hughes projects, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the so-called Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, he's named as the title of a public housing project in East Harlem. The implicit assumption in terms of racial segregation, Robert Moses, was these would always remain predominantly Black. And so there was a segregationist impulse there. Now remember, this was part of progressivism. Eleanor Roosevelt thought she was benevolent by including Blacks at all in public housing. She was so convinced that public housing was an amenity for the poor that her concern was that public housing might exclude Blacks. And she went out of her way to make sure there would be new all Black public housing projects built in Detroit. The Frederick Douglass houses, named again for an African American hero. She went to Detroit and cut the ribbon on the first all Black public housing. She thought that was benevolent. The progressives accepted racial segregation and were trying to foster, whether you call it separate but equal or not, but equal amenities for Blacks. And remember, Franklin Roosevelt made what you really can call a corrupt bargain with the Jim Crow South in his New Deal coalition. And so it's easy to view, he cut the ribbon on Techwood Homes in Atlanta, an all-white public housing project, and then its counterpart, University Houses in Atlanta, and all Black public housing. Many times, for instance, in New Bern, North Carolina, which I profile, these projects replaced mixed race neighborhoods. And so public housing became a vehicle for racial segregation. And I argue a vehicle for the lack of wealth accumulation by Black Americans. White Americans were advantaged by the Federal Housing Administration, the infamous redlining, to move to the suburbs with cheap mortgages. Black Americans, their slums, where there were many ownership situations. 30% of Black Washingtonians owned their own houses before slum clearance. Only 33% of whites did. And so what happened is when they were relocated into public housing, who's the owner of public housing? Not you or me, not the tenants, the government. And so Black Americans, who always constituted a disproportionate number of public housing residents, today 43%, only 13% of Americans' population is African American, but 43% of public and subsidized housing. You can't build wealth in public housing. And this was another blow, not only the segregation that it fostered, but the diminution of the possibility of wealth accumulation.
As more of these projects began sprouting up, how did the cities that they were in begin to change? How can we detect the impact of public housing on the rest of the city, economically, socially, politically?
Well, St. Louis is a great example because of the infamous Pruitt-Igoe projects, which, by the way, replaced the so-called slum, which had the oldest black church west of the Mississippi, all sorts of businesses, flour mills, all sorts of stuff. They tore it all down. White St. Louis residents moved en masse to the suburbs because they had these subsidized mortgages. Blacks were moved into these 33 11-story towers. 33 11-story towers. And so the segregation of St. Louis and other cities, white flight was facilitated by public housing.
Are there certain things that were done to reform once it became clear that these were not working? What were some of the steps that cities took to try to make things better, and how successful were those steps?
Well, the big change happened under Richard Nixon in 1973. If the key foundation stones, building blocks of public housing were Franklin Roosevelt and especially Harry Truman in the National Housing Act of 1949, the death knell for new bricks and mortar public housing was Richard Nixon's moratorium on new construction in 1973, in which he made a speech to the nation about the failure of public housing. That's how notorious it had become. And he mentioned Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis specifically as the embodiment of what we need, of what he called the physical and social isolation of poor Americans, facilitated public housing. And so he was the one who started what is now the major vehicle for housing assistance, housing vouchers. So instead of having an apartment in a publicly owned and managed housing development, 3.5 million, I might have the number wrong off the top of my head, households receive what you could call a housing stamp. It's a voucher where you can go to a private landlord, the government will pay 70% of your rent, and you get a subsidy that allows you to live in a private unit. The idea was that government couldn't do it, and this partnership with private owners would work out better. Unfortunately, that has led to concentrations of poverty, what Barbara Mikulski, who was a congresswoman from Baltimore, called horizontal rather than vertical ghettos. And so the South Shore of Chicago, the suburb where Pope Leo grew up, now has concentrations of housing vouchers. And so the poor have been relocated, but in many cases, the physical environs are still wanting, and they have this terrible disincentive to improve their situation. Would you sign a lease? Would any of the listeners to this great podcast sign a lease where the higher your income, the higher your rent, or the higher your mortgage? But that's what we ask poor people in America who receive housing vouchers to do. You pay 30% of your income in rent. That means as your income goes up, your rent goes up. And we should not be surprised that 87% of residents of housing voucher households stay for 5 years or more, 69% for 10 years or more, 20% of the 170,000 households in New York City public housing have been there for 40 years or more. We give them an incentive to stay forever, and there's no time limit. So this is creating a cul-de-sac of poverty.
Wow. What are your policy recommendations? If Howard were the emperor of public housing in America, what would you have us all do to make this a um, a safe place for people, and B, a place that people, as you put it, don't have to stay forever?
Well, I have too many ideas, and they're too wanton, but I'll try. I'll try a few accessible ones. I think we need, starting in 1996, we had a time limit on cash welfare, 5 years. It reduced the welfare rolls. A lot of poor people went to work. There's good evidence on this. We now devote much more for housing subsidies than we do for cash welfare, much more, but there is no time limit. I think a 5-year time limit is reasonable. And It would probably affect about 40% of the tenants. Now they're going to have to adjust, and that could be hard. But remember, there are long waiting lists for this is not an entitlement. Not everybody gets it, like Social Security or something like that. Only a handful of people essentially win the housing lottery where they get to stay forever. And there are long waiting lists. So I think it's reasonable to adopt a time limit. The Trump administration has proposed a 2-year time limit. I think that's too draconian, but I think some sort of time limit, we could call it a subsidy ceiling to make it sound less draconian. Choose your term. But I think that's the first thing we should do. And HUD is actually considering that now. Now, I think we should also take steps to retrofit the remaining physical public housing. And that's happening through something called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, which the Obama administration began, which brings in private funding to renovate and manage public housing projects. I still think you need a time limit for those tenants. And I would like to see 30%. Now I'm getting really wonky. Sorry about this.
Do one more. Sure. Yeah.
30% of public housing units are characterized by what's called overhousing. What the heck is that? That means they have empty bedrooms. In a great many cases, you have one elderly woman living in a 3-bedroom apartment. I think we ought to start chopping those up, make smaller apartments, because households have gotten smaller. And then I would even let tenants take in lodgers for income and eventually privatize the ownership of what's left. But that's in the long term.
Are there lessons that we can take from our experience with public housing and apply it to the rest of the housing in America? Obviously, there are enormous difficulties in paying for housing these days. Lots of people, almost every working person, is going to have trouble paying for their housing. What lessons can we take from public housing to make it easier for everybody to afford housing?
Well, one lesson is the government is good at cutting checks for Social Security. It's not too bad at delivering the mail, decent. It's not good at owning and managing real estate. So the idea that we should turn to that in some big new way is misguided. It's we tried it, and we can argue about we could have done it this way, we could have done that way, it worked out better. But when you have an experiment that's been already ongoing for 100 years, and you have the physical conditions that were characterized by the Congress in 1991 as severe distress, you shouldn't go down that road again. That's the Nietzsche definition of insanity. What we need to discover, in my opinion, and this gets back to my book, The Poor Side of Town, is what I call naturally occurring affordable housing. And my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Ed Pinto, and his colleague Tobias Peter talk about infill housing, where you build naturally occurring affordable housing because it's small homes on small lots. And many, many communities have empty lots or non-dense construction, even in their downtowns. You could fill in with smaller units, row houses. Philadelphia built between 1880 and 1930, 299,000 row houses. That's such a vast construction of affordable housing, but it was all private. It can be done if we have the right regulatory climate. You got to have zoning that permits density. And that's the key, really. And starting with post-World War II, we allowed the suburbs to basically zone out almost everything affordable.
Is our political system still capable of solving things like this, problems this massive?
Well, I hope so. I think that what happens when our system works well is pressure builds up on certain issues, right? Pressure builds up. There was so much pressure for a COVID vaccine that Trump did something utterly unusual. He paid vaccine developers for the vaccine before they had it. That had never been done in government before because there was so much public pressure. I'm hoping that in many of these suburban communities that have the large lot zoning, there's going to start to be pressure from kids who grow up there. I'd like to stay, Mom and Dad. Teachers and firefighters and EMTs saying, we don't want to have to commute 100 miles to save your life.
Mm.
So I'm hoping that there can be the political pressure that comes from reality that will start to create pressure. And we're seeing something called the Yes in My Backyard movement, YIMBY, which is moving in that direction. Even in California, we've seen accessory dwelling units be legalized in California and in other communities. And those can be the infill housing that we need. We need more production. We need small houses on small lots. And we don't need a vast government replacement of private housing. We tried it, and it led to collateral damage.
Who is your audience for this book? Are you hoping that policymakers read this? Who do you want to read this most?
I certainly want congressional staff to read it. I certainly want the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to read it. I hope that history academics might include it in their syllabi, because I think it's full of cautionary lessons, and it's just kind of a fascinating story. How did this happen in the first place? That mystery that intrigued me as a reporter type, I think, is engaging. So I'd love to see it's an academic published book in New York University Press. So I'm hoping that academics will pick it up. I'd love to see a film made. I used to make documentary films for WGBH in Boston, including history films. There's a film, people can find it online, America's First School, the history of the oldest public school in the United States, Boston Latin School. History has always fascinated me. I'm hoping that I see that the great series American Experience has been defunded, which is heartbreaking. But I'd love to see a film made about the lost neighborhoods of Black America. I have a big focus in the book on the Hill in Pittsburgh, which was where August Wilson, probably the greatest American playwright of the 20th century, grew up, and most of his plays are set. Fences, Jitney, torn down for public housing. I think it's a great film, and owners there lost wealth. Great jazz clubs were torn down. Much was lost. I'd love to see a film about the lost neighborhoods of Black America, and maybe somebody will pick it up and say, yeah, I want to help you make that film.
People are very emotionally connected to their homes, even when an outsider might say they're not much to look at. Was there a moment for you during your studies that you became particularly emotional in either interviewing somebody or reading about an experience somebody had?
Yes. I went to New Bern, North Carolina, which is the first capital of North Carolina, colonial. A beautiful replica of the British governor's house stands there, fascinating history. And I interviewed a group of African-American leaders there who talked about the neighborhood where they grew up that was torn down, and how the church was within walking distance, how their families owned the house, how, yeah, they remembered white, quote unquote, slumlords going by to collect the rent, horse carts carrying fresh fruits and vegetables, good and bad, not perfect, but vibrant, dynamic, organic neighborhood. When they told me about their loss, that as an urban historian type, that breaks my heart.
You dedicated the book to Robin. Who is Robin?
She's my wife of 49 years.
And how did she earn her dedication?
She is a demanding proofreader. I never satisfy her. So in that way, she holds my feet to the fire.
Howard Husock, the author of The Projects, A New History of Public Housing. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Evan.
Check the book out. AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it. It also has featured episodes and a link to that Patreon page. Check out Nikki's work. It's fantastic. And go to that Patreon page. It's at patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We donate parts of every contribution to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today. conversations with America's top nonfiction authors, and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.